Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome all of you to the 2014 Mansfield Conference, The Fight for Hope and Freedom, Human Trafficking, Montana, and the World. The Mansfield Conference has been an important annual forum in Montana to examine the national policy debates that shape American democracy and governance, explore the critical trends that impact our relationship with the Asia-Pacific region, and debate some of the biggest challenges to our understanding of ethics today. The goal is to promote international education, challenge our students and communities to think globally, and inspire them to get involved in our world today. No doubt, the Mansfield Conference this year aspires to these same goals as we explore the disturbing issue of global human trafficking. These few days, we will be opening your eyes to one of the biggest criminal industries of our generation. Close to 800,000 people are trafficked across international borders each year, while more than 20 million are trapped in some form of modern-day slavery. Today will not be an easy day. You will hear upsetting stories of exploitation and cruelty. You will see disconcerting images that will deeply disturb you. And you may even feel anger, disgust, and unsettling emotions about the troubles of our world and the dangers that our children and our communities face. But today is not about despair or about defeat. Today is about hope. Today is about hearing and being inspired how leaders and communities around the world and in our state are fighting for freedom and justice and providing hope to men, women, and children stuck in modern-day slavery. Today is about concerned citizens and how Montanan communities can exchange ideas, learn from each other, and cooperate together to protect our neighborhoods against human trafficking. And today is about taking action and getting involved in this fight for freedom. So we encourage you to meet each other, discuss with each other, and work together on how we can take steps forward in this fight against modern-day oppression. The Mansfield Center is deeply grateful to the many sponsors and partners that have joined us to support this important conference. First, we'd like to especially thank Seroptimus International, our co-sponsor of this conference, and of course, our home institution of the University of Montana, the law school, its business school, and also the many businesses in our communities like GCS Research, Good Works Ventures, and Fuel Montana Media, and civic groups such as Montana World Affairs Council and the concerned individuals in our community. Now I'd like to thank and invite up to the podium President Royce Engstrom, one of Mansfield Center's biggest supporters, to provide his welcome remarks and introduce Lieutenant Governor Angela McKay this morning. Dr. Engstrom.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Good morning. What a pleasure it is to see all of you here. Truly an international audience here today, ranging from right here in Missoula to around the globe. I'm so delighted to have all of you here for this conference, Fight for Hope and Freedom, Human Trafficking, Montana, and the World. I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the University of Montana campus. For those of you who are here for the first time, you have the privilege of being on one of the most beautiful campuses in the United States. And so we're delighted to have you visit, whether you're here for the first time or a return visitor. The Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center is a true treasure of the University of Montana. Senator Mansfield and then Ambassador Mansfield represented this state and this country with distinction. Upon his retirement, Congress took the extremely rare action of creating an endowment that established and has supported sister organizations, the Mansfield Foundation based in Washington, D.C., and the Mansfield Center here at the University of Montana. The Washington, D.C. organization is closely tied to the university, and I have the privilege of serving on its board by virtue of my position as president here at UM. That board is a high-powered group comprised of business people and policymakers from around the world who have a connection to either Asia or Senator Mansfield. It is chaired by former Vice President Walter Mondale, and it has been a true pleasure to get to know him. The Mansfield Center here at UM brings distinction to our academic offerings, our research, our scholarship, and our outreach efforts as a university. As Dr. Kim mentioned, its primary mission focuses on East Asia, an area of the world in which Mike Mansfield had an intense interest, and on ethics and policy making, to which Mike Mansfield was deeply dedicated and demonstrated on a daily basis. I'm sad that I never had the opportunity to meet Mike, but extremely proud that his legacy lives on here at the University of Montana. The Mansfield Center carries out its mission through ambitious and hard-hitting programming. Programs such as the Confucius Institute, which brings language and cultural education to K-12 students in Montana. The Mansfield International Training Program, the American Youth Leadership Program that recently focused on Cambodia, the Vietnamese Affairs Program, the Defense Critical Languages Program that prepares our military personnel with language skills, and other extensive interactions with China, Japan, Korea. The Mansfield Center represents a whirlwind of activity, and most of it is generated by the staff's hard work to secure projects and funding from sources beyond the university. The center has been blessed with forward-thinking leadership and staff, and I notice in the audience several of the former directors of the Mansfield Center here. I am so delighted that we have just recently attracted Dr. Abraham Kim to the University of Montana to lead the Mansfield Center into its future. Abe is an energetic, knowledgeable, and extremely effective person, and I've really enjoyed getting to know him. I would like at this point for Abe and the staff of the Mansfield Center to just stand and let us thank you for the tremendous work that you're doing on behalf of the University of Montana. So would all of the staff of the Mansfield Center, people associated with the center, please stand and let us thank you. These Mansfield conferences have become signature events for both the center and for the university. They've earned a reputation for tackling tough questions and for bringing outstanding people to the university. This year's conference exemplifies that approach, addressing this difficult issue of human trafficking. Not a pleasant or an easy topic by any means, but one that we must address as a nation and as a state. I'm proud that the Mansfield Center chose this hard-hitting issue for this conference, and I look forward to learning more about it. I am now proud to introduce a tremendous friend of the University of Montana, a tremendous friend of higher education, and notably one of the most vocal Grizz fans in the state of Montana, our Lieutenant Governor, the Honorable Angela McLean. I consider Angela a personal friend as well, and I've so enjoyed getting to know her in these past few years. Angela is a native of Twin Bridges and an Anaconda resident now. She became Montana's 31st Lieutenant Governor just this past February when she was appointed by Steve Bullock. Angela is an educator and a classroom teacher. She's taught American history and government at Anaconda High School prior to being tapped as Lieutenant Governor. In 2003, Angela was named the best high school teacher by the Montana Standard. She also served as chair of the Montana Board of Regents prior to being appointed as Lieutenant Governor, and she had previously served on the Montana Board of Public Education. Angela worked through high school as a waitress at the Blue Anchor Cafe. Anybody been to the Blue Anchor Cafe? Not too many, Angela. And she is a 1989 graduate of Twin Bridges High School. She earned a bachelor's degree in 1994 from Western Montana College in Dillon, now the University of Montana Western, becoming the first member of her family to graduate from college. She went on to earn her Master of Arts in Curriculum and Instruction from the University of Montana in 2000, and in 2005 she became nationally board certified in social studies, history, adolescence, and young adulthood. After graduating from Western Montana College, Angela began her teaching career at Arlee High School and Middle School. Angela and her husband Mike, who is an attorney, returned to his hometown of Anaconda, where they raised their family. They are parents of Colin, an 8th grader, and Ellen, who's in 4th grade. She enjoys spending time with her family, as well as skiing, bicycling, hiking, and camping. Angela is also taught as an adjunct professor at Montana Tech in Butte. I heard it said the other day that Angela McLean gets more done by 6 a.m. than most of us do in the course of our entire day, and I certainly believe that. I know her as an extremely energetic and effective individual. It is such a pleasure to have Lieutenant Governor McLean here. Angela, welcome to the University of Montana.
Thank you so very much, President Engstrom, for that very kind and thoughtful introduction. I want to also express my appreciation to Dr. Abraham Kim for the invitation to be a part of this remarkable conversation today here at the University of Montana. My thanks to each of you for being here today to participate in the 2014 Mansfield Conference Fight for Hope and Freedom. Governor Bullock and I applaud you, Dr. Kim, and each of the folks who worked tirelessly to bring this conversation about the fight for hope and freedom to the University of Montana and to each of the conference participants. It is a remarkable opportunity, and I am in no way surprised that it is the University of Montana who would lead the way in such a challenging conversation. We applaud your efforts and the goals of the conference to elevate this conversation in Montana and to bring folks to the table to discuss important steps to fight human trafficking. As technological advances improve, our world becomes increasingly a global community without borders. Therefore, it is imperative that regardless of where we live, that we seek to make our state, our nation, and our world a safer, better place for ours and for generations to come. In his post as Attorney General and now as Montana's governor, Steve Bullock understands the importance of keeping our communities safe and works every single day to ensure public safety across the Big Sky state. I have seen us progress from where we were just a year ago, but we are far from where we need to be in the fight for hope and freedom. With the work of the governor's office and legislators from both sides of the aisle, we saw legislation passed to revise laws regarding human trafficking. These laws establish a mandatory posting of National Trafficking Resource Center hotlines. The postings raise awareness and create vigilance. The fight for hope and freedom continues in partnership with the federal government's Department of Homeland Security and its Blue Campaign. This federal strategic action plan on services for victims of human trafficking in the United States provides a platform for stakeholders and other interested parties to offer individual feedback and gain a better understanding from experts, much like the ones gathered here at the 2014 Mansfield Conference, Fight for Hope and Freedom. Additionally, new technological advances to track and disrupt traffickers, and with the focus of efforts, we can take significant steps towards protecting all citizens and reducing the incidence of trafficking. The conversation about trafficking is one that transcends state boundaries. It transcends the oceans and it transcends the borders of countries around the world. By each of you here today engaging local, state, national, and international stakeholders in today's conversation, you hold in your hands the remarkable ability to make a difference. In the words of Margaret Mead, never doubt that a group of thoughtful citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. After examining the list of conference speakers, I have no doubt that each of you will leave this 2014 Mansfield Conference with wisdom, with knowledge, and empowered to fight for hope and freedom for those who are unable to fight for themselves. And so it is, ladies and gentlemen, whether we come from Montana or from Nepal or somewhere in between, what matters is that we came together today for this cause. Governor Bullock and I believe that in public service, it is critical to give voice to the voiceless and to advocate for those who need one the most. We thank you, Dr. Kim, and all who worked so tirelessly to make this conference happen. And we commend each of you for your commitment to giving voice to such an important topic and for advocating on behalf of victims here and around the globe. My appreciation to each of you. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, President Engstrom. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor McLean, for your thoughtful and inspiring remarks. We appreciate it very much for your presence here today. We'd like to get started with our conference today with our first panel that will help set the tone and provide the context to our conference. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Kimber McKay, a professor of anthropology here at the University of Montana, and part of the global management team of the humanitarian nonprofit group ISIS Foundation. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Kimber McKay and invite our first panel speakers to come on stage right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Abe, and thank you, audience members, for the time and attention you're giving to the topic of the 2014 Mansfield Conference. My name is Kimber McKay, and I'm this morning's moderator. I'm a professor of anthropology here at the U of M and a researcher for the international nonprofit organization, the ISIS Foundation. One of my main research sites is in Nepal, where I've lived and worked with people from the Northwest Himalayas for over 20 years. Child trafficking has been a blight on these villages for nearly 15 of those 20 years, and I've grown familiar with the local people's understanding of this process. During this conference, you will be hearing from professionals from all over the world, including Nepal, about facets of human trafficking that you may not have previously considered. Not all trafficking involves the sex trade, although the focus of this morning's speaker's remarks will focus on that, or the focus of Melissa Farley's remarks this morning will be on that topic. In Nepal, for instance, we see trafficking for many different reasons, not always associated with the sex trade. Most families in the villages where I work who are involved in trafficking were, at least from the perspective of the parents, simply trying to help their kids avoid conscription by the rebels in Nepal's recent Maoist revolution. They thought that they were paying for their kids to be removed from their homes and taken to decent boarding schools somewhere else, somewhere safer and with better promises for the future. At least that's what they were told. From the perspective of the man taking their money, it's clear that his intentions were very different. The push and pull factors behind human trafficking, the sheer accidents of victimhood, the intentions and criminality of many of the perpetrators of the offenses against the basic human rights of the trafficked will all, among other things, be discussed today and tomorrow. Welcome to Montana. Thank you for traveling from near and far, and welcome to this conference. Now I'd like to introduce the speakers for today. We have one speaker, Dr. Melissa Farley, and one discussant, Dr. Teresa Sobieszczyk. If you have a question at the end, please line up behind that microphone that's located out there in the audience, and I will acknowledge each person lined up in turn. I'll introduce our discussant, Teresa, first. Teresa is the Director of International Development Studies and Peace Corps prep programs at the University of Montana, as well as an associate professor in the Sociology department and a member of the Executive Committee for the Women's and Gender Studies program. She received her doctorate in development sociology from Cornell University and has published on various population and development issues in Southeast Asia, including international labor recruitment and human trafficking. She's presented her research on debt, bondage, labor migration, a form of trafficking, at the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. She has previously served as a Peace Corps volunteer in rural Thailand and has also volunteered with the Home for Quality of Life Development in Phai, Thailand, which provides for and educates ethnic minority children at risk of being sold into prostitution. She occasionally teaches a course called Prostitution and Trafficking here at the University of Montana. Her remarks will follow our first speaker for this conference, Dr. Melissa Farley, who I will describe next. Dr. Farley has practiced as a clinical psychologist for 45 years. She brings that experience to her consultations with agencies, governments, and advocates for prostituted and trafficked women. She has articulated the harms of prostitution, pornography, and trafficking as an expert witness in forensic evaluations. She has been categorized as a legal expert on the effects of sexual violence against women and children, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociation, prostitution, and trafficking. Dr. Farley has written 24 peer-reviewed articles on prostitution and trafficking, as well as 2 books entitled Prostitution, Trafficking, and Traumatic Stress, published in 2004, and Prostitution and Trafficking in Nevada, Making the Connections, published in 2007. Her research has been used by governments in South Africa, Canada, New Zealand, Ghana, Sweden, the UK, and the United States for education and policy development on prostitution and trafficking. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Melissa Farley. Help me welcome her.
Thank you for being here today. I hope this information that I'm going to give you today will enable you to challenge men's assumption that they're entitled to buy sex. And I also hope that it will help you take specific steps to enable women to exit the sex industry in this state. I also want to thank Diane Yaris and the Seroptimists for introducing me to Dr. Abraham Kim, and I thank Dr. Kim and the Mansfield Center for inviting me here. I'm really happy to be here. So, looking forward to this and to spending a couple days here. Trafficking is the business of sexual exploitation. Here's how the narrative goes. It's the oldest profession. You'll never get rid of it. It's a victimless crime. All men do it. It's easy money. Prostitution is totally different from trafficking, and it's a free choice. It's voluntary and consenting. These mythical narratives are pimp, trafficker, and sex buyer propaganda. But we've learned to see past these lies to the truth of women's experiences in prostitution and trafficking. Public awareness about prostitution and trafficking have grown tremendously in the last decade because of the courageous voices of survivors, of NGO advocates and research. Buying sex is at the extreme end of a continuum of violence against women. It's on the same continuum as incest, battering, sadistic verbal abuse, and rape. Prostitution is the renting out of a woman's mouth, vagina, and anus. And as a sex buyer put it, it's renting an organ for 10 minutes. The existence of prostitution anywhere is society's betrayal of women, and its betrayal of those who are marginalized and vulnerable because of their sex, their ethnicity, and their poverty, and the history of abuse and neglect as well. Prostitution is sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, and often torture. I've spent 15 years with the nonprofit Prostitution Research and Education studying prostitution and trafficking in 9 countries on 5 continents and across diverse cultures, very, very different locations. The effects of prostitution and the effects of trafficking are much the same. A Canadian woman said, "What is rape for others is normal for us." A woman at a legal brothel in Nevada said, "It's like you sign a contract to be raped." In Chicago, the same frequency of rape was reported by women in both escort and street prostitution. Women in prostitution are seen as body parts or fake girlfriends whose feelings are irrelevant. They're not considered fully human. The emotional consequences of prostitution are the same in widely varying cultures, whether it is high class or low class, legal or illegal, indoor or outdoor, a brothel, a strip club, like the Fox Club or Fred's right here in Missoula, a massage parlor, or the street. Symptoms of emotional distress in all forms of prostitution are off the charts. Depression, suicidality, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociation, substance abuse, eating disorders. That's what happens when you're trafficked for prostitution. The dissociation is necessary so that she can survive the activity of prostitution, so that she can create another person inside of herself, the not me who turns the tricks. The real me who's a mom, a student, someone's daughter. Dissociation in prostitution was usually a survival response to childhood sexual assault. Survivors explain, "It was easy for me to turn a trick because I could just take myself out like with my dad. It was like I took myself out of the situation and just focused on something else, and it's like I wasn't even there." 2/3 of the men, women, and transgendered in prostitution that we've interviewed all over the globe met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. This level of extreme emotional distress, 67%, is in the same league as the most emotionally traumatized groups of people ever studied by psychologists: battered women, raped women, combat vets, and state-sponsored torture survivors. So pimping is third-party control, and trafficking is pimping, and trafficking is third-party control. I want to really demystify this concept of trafficking for you. People think it's something exotic, something one of a kind. It isn't. Traffickers are good old-fashioned thugs and predators, and the more we call them pimps, the better in my book. Yes, let's throw every federal statute that we've got at them, every good law that we can, let's use to lock them up. But just think of them as pimps. And somebody who's trafficked is somebody who is under the control of a third party. And I'll talk a little bit about that some more. Sex trafficking is defined as transportation, transfer, harbor, or receipt of a human being for the purpose of sexual exploitation. That's what pimps do. Pimping and trafficking are the same thing. And let me tell you about a study. We've reviewed 15 studies and anecdotal research, reports from the frontline advocates, and more formal research. And across these 15 studies, we're finding that 83% of people in the world are trafficked or under third-party control. UN Rapporteur on Violence, Sigma Huda, said, most of the time in the world, prostitution meets the legal definition of trafficking. That's my experience also. So where are trafficking victims located? The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services acknowledged that trafficking victims are located not only in street and brothel prostitution, which is what's most familiar to people, but also, and brothel prostitution in Montana is someone's house, just like it is in San Francisco. It's a rental home. That's what a brothel looks like. It's nothing special, and the more they can stay under the radar, the better. The thing that makes it hard for them to stay under the radar is cars coming up at intervals of 10 minutes, 24/7. That's how they get busted in San Francisco, in my neighborhood. So HHS has said that trafficking victims are located in street and brothels, but also in pornography, stripping, massage parlors, spas, live video cam sex shows, mail order brides or servile marriages, military prostitution, and prostitution tourism, which some people call sex tourism. So here's where trafficking happens in Montana. Strip clubs, 24/7 strippers to you. This took me 15 minutes on the web Googling to find this. If I can find it that easy, believe me, sex buyers can find it faster than me. The ultimate strip club list, better than Craigslist. You've got reviews and chat boards of sex buyers commenting on what's available for sex buyers in the state. You've got Wiki Sex Guide giving you detailed information about the sex industry throughout the state and the region. And we have a cell phone app from Deja Vu, which is a chain of strip clubs in the U.S. In San Francisco, Deja Vu now owns more than 50% of the strip clubs. And having interviewed a guy who was a Deja Vu manager for 20 years, he's very clear that they're connected with the Italian mafia. Much of trafficking and pimping is organized crime. A few years back, a man named Frank Colacurcio in Seattle was busted by federal agents, and he owns a number of strip clubs in the Seattle area. What did they get him on? Anybody want to guess? That's it. Yay. They got him on, the IRS got him on tax fraud, money laundering. Sometimes you have to be creative in bringing these guys in. This is a cash business, and if you can document that, sometimes you can bring down the guys like Colacurcio who are really running the show. So I want to talk a little bit about the nature of consent and coercion, because people, I hope to give you some information that is going to help dismantle this notion that prostitution is an act between consenting adults. Nothing could be further from the truth. We really need a deeper understanding of how coercion operates in women's lives. In prostitution, one person wants sex and the other does not. The money entices, persuades, or coerces the person to perform sex. Yet his payment does not erase the sexual violence, verbal sadism, domestic violence, and rape that goes along with the payment of that money. Prostitution is not a choice because the conditions that make choice possible are not present. Physical safety, equal power with buyers, and real alternatives. If you imagine a pyramid, imagine that only 2% of women in prostitution are at the top of that pyramid. These are women who are usually privileged by race, class, and education, and they usually have options to escape. They're in prostitution for a very short time, and they're on TV talk shows touting how great it is. That's not what real prostitution is, which is what the other 98% is. This group of people do not have viable alternatives. They're coerced into prostitution by inequality, sex inequality, ethnic, race inequality, and economic inequality. Those are the 3 bars on the cage of trafficking. A sex buyer said, "If I don't see a chain on her leg, then I assume she's made the choice to be there." Some of our laws, unfortunately, reflect the same attitude. If there's no evidence of force, then her experience is dismissed as voluntary or consenting. There are many ways of coercing a woman, as everyone in this room knows. Sometimes women can appear to consent to their own exploitation. It looks like a choice, but it's a coerced choice. Nonetheless, she still has been exploited or harmed and still deserves our assistance. As a man in one of our studies, we've moved from mainly focusing on victims of trafficking to look at the perps, and we've now studied sex buyers in 5 countries with many, many colleagues and collaborators. We've done over 700 interviews of men who buy sex. And one study, we compared sex buyers with men who don't buy sex. And one guy said something that was stunningly helpful to me. "I don't think prostitution is quite the same as rape. Rape is worse, but it's close to the rape end of the spectrum. It's not rape because there's superficial consent. On the face of it, the prostitute is agreeing to it. But deeper down, you can see that life circumstances have kind of forced her into it. It's like someone jumping from a burning building. You could say they made the choice to jump, but you could also say they had no choice." The inequality of consent means that one person gives in to the other person. The side imposing consent, has almost all the power, and the consenting side has little or no power. For example, people who've suffered attempted genocide are forced to sign treaties that consent to destroy their land, as in this image. This is what consent looks like. All the power is on one side, very, very little of the power is on the other side. Or a woman who performs a sex act for a cheeseburger or a tank of gas. That's not a real choice. Resource extraction is often accompanied by prostitution and trafficking. The ecosystem destruction caused by fracking to access oil and gas are paralleled by the quieter destruction of trafficked women who service the frackers and the destructive effects on all women in the community. While silver and copper were mined in Butte, there were streets that were lined with brothels. In 1902, the Butte miner proudly described the prostitution zone where women were trafficked to service the miners. Today, police and prosecutors note an increase in crimes against women in the Bakken. Rape has increased since the flood of pipeline workers have moved into the man camps, military-style barracks housing. Women in Williston report that men look at them as if they're meat. They can't shop without men stalking them around the store. A woman and her friend were at a bar when 5 men offered to pay them to strip naked at the man's home. A young woman was walking to work. A car comes up behind her. Guy hops out, starts to drag her to the car. She manages to escape. And as we all know, in another instance, a teacher who was jogging did not. She was raped and murdered. Exploring the connections between environmental abuse and the abuse of women, anthropologist Peggy Sanday studied rape-free and rape-prone cultures and found that they went together. Where there was environmental degradation, there were high levels of sexual violence, and vice versa. Like other states, Montana has a history of trafficking women, very much like in California, starting with the relocation of American Indians during the colonization of their resources. Native children were transported into boarding schools, cultural treasures were attacked and exploited, resources extracted, and as a result, poverty and prostitution exploded. Today, women have been pimped on reservations and from reservations to other locations. North Dakota police are also already reporting Fort Berthold reservation trafficking. We did a study in Minnesota of the trafficking of Native American women in Minnesota and found extremely high levels of homelessness, emotional distress, and a lack of access to services. We really have to look very, very carefully at the impact of development on both the environment and on women. Women tend not to be included in economic policy development. That is a mistake. When oil companies' reps visited towns along the pipeline that was proposed in Russia and the Caucasus, they promised jobs, schools, hospitals, and small business investment. Instead, what local communities in that part of the world got was a huge population of migrant men, increase in pollution, trafficking, poverty, and STDs, right along the pipeline route. So just as there's a shift in awareness, I'm going to talk about sex buyers now and some of our findings on that, which I hope will be useful to you. Just as there's a shift of awareness that happened in the battered women's movement from the woman to the batterer, the same shift is happening in our field, from the victim to the perpetrator. And we're learning a lot from what men who buy sex tell us. The stigma of prostitution is moving from the victim to the John. This is a good thing. When men who buy sex explain prostitution in almost the same terms as women. If you look at it, it's paid rape, one man told me. She has to do what you want. I use them like I might use any other amenity. Restaurant or a public convenience. Another man rather chillingly said, "You get what you pay for without the no." Men who buy sex are more likely to commit acts of sexual violence against non-prostituting women than other men. They're more likely to have raped, according to their own reports. We found big differences in empathy between men who buy sex and men who don't, not surprisingly. You have to turn off your ability to relate to another person if you're buying sex. This actually isn't good for men in the long run. It's not good for them at all. And they tell us that. Compared to a matched group of sex buyers, they were matched on age, ethnicity, and educational level, we found that men who buy sex had a stronger preference for non-relational sex. They had a much greater number of sex partners overall, not just in prostitution, but overall. They more often learned about sex from pornography. They more often feared rejection from women, and they had a more hostile view of themselves as men. They also committed, we didn't expect to find this, the sex buyers were committing many, many, many more crimes, significant differences between the groups of a whole range of crimes. Nonetheless, most men don't buy sex, and I think that's important to know. However, even if most men don't buy sex, they don't come out and confront their brothers who do buy sex about that practice. And we need that deafening silence to end. We need more men who choose not to buy sex to speak out about why that is. What policies and laws work in this field? You know, here's where I can give you some really good news. And there really is cause for hope. Globally, the tide is turning against the sex industry. There's a new understanding that women in prostitution should be considered victims and not criminals. This is what's happening in, for example, New York. The days of prostitution being a victimless crime are over, said State Police Officer Lawton. He likened the change in attitudes to previous efforts to beef up domestic prostitution laws. We're learning what deterrents work and what do not. The most effective deterrents we found, according to the men themselves, any kind of public exposure or jail time, any amount of jail time, 1 hour, 2 hours in jail for soliciting prostitution is a very, very effective and educational process for sex buyers. If they're convinced the laws will be enforced. Most men don't think the law is going to be enforced, and guess what? They're right. This is, prostitution is considered a misdemeanor, unfortunately, and many law enforcement are not moving on this, even though there's a trend in some states like New York, like parts of California, to aggressively do sweeps where men are arrested. The least effective deterrent was an educational program with no lasting legal consequences. You sit in a 6-hour program, you get the record of solicitation wiped off the record. Not a good idea. Education is fine, but let's leave the arrest in the criminal justice system record. We don't let guys attend a 6-hour educational session if they steal a 6-pack of beer and get that wiped off. Why are we even considering removing a record of buying a human being for sex? We shouldn't be doing that. So what are some legal steps to ending trafficking? 2 research studies show that legal prostitution is a failed experiment. In the world, wherever you have legal prostitution, you have dramatic increases in prostitution. Well, let me just talk a little bit more about that. How much time do I have? I can't see that. Sorry. 5? Okay. Legalization has led to an explosion of organized crime and trafficking in the Netherlands and Germany. 80% of women in the sex industries there are trafficked. But slowly, the legal invisibility is fading. And so here are what we need to do. This could happen tomorrow in Montana. Enforce existing laws that criminalize sex buyers right now. Hold sex buyers legally accountable. Decriminalize victim. Don't spend your time arresting women in prostitution. Refer them for services. And let's have more services. And provide victim support. Men arrested for buying sex can be used as witnesses in trafficking cases. We don't need to arrest and interrogate victims. Arrest and interrogate perps. You can learn an incredible amount of trafficking networks. As the Swedish expert said, if you start with a customer, you can prove the whole trafficking chain. The Swedish law does three things. It arrests men who buy sex at a felony level. It decriminalizes the person selling sex, the woman, man, or transgendered person in prostitution, and it provides major state funding for exit services. After 10 years, Sweden now has the lowest rate of trafficking in the European Union. If you want to stop trafficking, they've shown us how to do it. And the closer we can get to that law, the better. Iceland, Norway, and South Korea have passed versions of the Swedish law. South Africa, Israel, France, Scotland, and UK are all considering it right now. Here are a few thoughts in closing. A police officer in Las Vegas and a pimp in Detroit both told me, if you want to understand the sex industry, look at zoning. Now, in this state, that means zoning for strip clubs, all sex industry-related businesses, probably bars. If you see 12 bars showing up in a small town where there's a lot of the barracks housing for mining, you're going to get a lot of prostitution happening out of bars and certain motels. Investigate prostitution and trafficking online. 80%, 90% of prostitution today is online. That's where it's happening. In February of this year, Houston, which is another oil-based economy, arrested 52 people, including a police officer, for trying to buy sex. Explaining their focus, Sheriff Adrian Garcia said, stopping prostitution fights back against sex slavery and other forms of human trafficking. So I suggest that if any public official, including a police officer, is arrested for buying sex, they immediately go on unpaid administrative leave until the charge is resolved. If they're convicted, they should leave the job. Corrupt public guardians have to go. Let's don't make, one other thing along those lines. How about if oil companies hiring men to work the back end agree to fire any employee who buys sex? That kind of agreement can be brokered. We can make it. That will reduce trafficking into Montana. It's not a good business environment for pimps if customers are getting arrested. It's a mistake to separate sex and labor trafficking with respect to women. We need to look at labor trafficking through a gender lens. When a woman is trafficked for agricultural labor, domestic servitude, factory work, these women are also almost always exploited in prostitution-like activities and always in order to keep their job. They're always looking over their shoulder at who is going to be coming after them next. And on the other side, lots of women in prostitution are their labor is exploited, and they're expected to clean and cook and give legitimate massages. Let's don't separate children from adults. In the sex industry, wherever adults are sold, children are sold. You just can't separate the two. What do you think would have happened if the abolitionists in the United States who were trying to end transatlantic slavery had gone onto plantations and say, are you under 18? Are you under 18? Come with me, I'm going to leave your mama and daddy and brothers here. I don't think so. Let's end all prostitution, because that's how we end trafficking. So, state laws must include demand reduction strategies. As a Swedish detective explained, trafficking is a business and we're trying to destroy the market. I hope some of this information has been useful. I'm going to talk tomorrow at the workshop about how to use the resources on our website, prostitutionresearch.com, which has extensive resources for policy and on sex buyers and on racism. And some people have found it very useful to use those. So I thank you for being here, and thanks for coming this morning.
Great. Thank you again to Abe Kim for organizing this wonderful conference for 2 days, and also to Dr. Farley for your thoughtful remarks regarding the intersection of prostitution and human trafficking. Sex trafficking is clearly an important part of human trafficking, but it's important not to assume that trafficking is only prostitution, or, as Dr. Farley pointed out, that all prostitutes are necessarily trafficked. Let me just remind you of the United Nations definition of human trafficking. Article 3, paragraph A of the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons defines trafficking in persons as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation in this definition includes, at a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. So this definition can really broaden our understanding of the various dimensions of trafficking. I think it's also important to recognize that the ways of framing and talking about trafficking are varied and contested. As Jeffries has pointed out, the framing of trafficking tends to be dominated by government officials, NGOs providing assistance to victims, and not by the trafficked persons themselves. The ways that trafficking has been framed have been shaped to a large degree by mass media, which of course focuses on some of the most egregious cases and criminalization, but maybe to a much lesser extent on the success stories of trafficked persons who make good and return home wealthy or with a foreign spouse. Of course, the ways trafficking is conceptualized can have very important impacts on the types of efforts taken to deal with it. Trafficking is quite a difficult phenomenon to measure, as most of you know in the audience. The UN has attempted to gather some estimates of global trafficking, and these range from fewer than 1 million persons per year to upwards of 12 million persons per year. So it's quite a range of estimates. UNESCO and the International Organization for Migration have tried to present these estimates to gauge the extent of human trafficking, but it's generally acknowledged that such estimates tend to undercount, in particular, forced labor, and they also tend to exclude trade in human body parts. So again, even the estimates that we're able to come up with are flawed. It's also important to recognize that trafficking can be within one country or crossing international borders, and these dimensions make the record keeping all the more difficult. Agencies may be counting only certain types of trafficked victims, such as those who receive certain types of assistance, while missing those who were trafficked but escaped their trafficker or pay off their bonded debt? Are some or all international marriage migrants, for instance, trafficked? And if so, are they included in estimates of human trafficking? Overall, we find that the lack of methodological transparency means that it's really hard to compile, compare, and adjust estimates to get a better understanding of the size of this problem. For instance, trafficking victims may be wrongly identified by law enforcement officials as illegal migrants, or the numbers of trafficked persons may be grossly inflated with a raid on a brothel if officials assume that all of the people working in the brothel have been trafficked, whether or not they've actually been trafficked. Even the identification of traffickers can be tricky. Law enforcement officials, for example, may not register pimps as traffickers, even if in reality they are actually trafficking in persons. So we have a great deal of difficulty in counting or estimating the extent of human trafficking. There's also widespread debate about which aspect or aspects of trafficking to focus on. There are 6 main conceptual approaches to human trafficking, and let me tell you about those 6. First of all, trafficking as a modern form of slavery, which would include forced labor of all kinds, including child soldiers. Trafficking as an example of global crime, or as a problem of transnational organized crime, thus related to the Yakuza or the Mafia, various triads. As synonymous with prostitution, as a migration problem, and also trafficking as a human rights challenge. Depending on the conceptual approach, the estimates of traffickers and trafficking victims, the analysis of the problem, and the solutions proposed will vary. The competing ways of conceptualizing trafficking may overlap, coexist, contradict each other, and of course change over time. For instance, Dr. Farley in her remarks focused a lot on trafficking as prostitution and as a human rights challenge, but she didn't necessarily focus on the migration aspects of human trafficking or the similarities between trafficking and other forms of labor recruitment and migration. In contrast, my research in the Thai context, which included some trafficking, focused more on trafficking on a continuum with other types of legal and illegal labor recruitment and migration. Besides conceptual and definitional differences, it's also important to recognize the varied contexts of human trafficking. As Dinan argued, international trafficking networks flourish where migration pressures are strong, legal migration opportunities are limited, and existing migrant networks are insufficient to overcome barriers to migration. Migration pressures can be especially strong in places with significant poverty, armed conflict, ethnic persecution, the breakdown of government, social inequality, and/or other processes of globalization. And so it's against these broader social, economic, and political contexts that trafficking can best be understood. Consider, for example, the case of Moldova in Eastern Europe, where 50% of the population is living below the poverty line, and where many children and youth live in grim and inadequately funded orphanages. In such a context, labor migration may be viewed as the only viable way to improve one's life chances. It's no wonder then that Moldovans are one of the top 2 nationalities identified by officials in the Balkan international sex trafficking networks. While the contexts of trafficking are far too varied to deal with here, I'd just like to ask everyone to keep in mind the different contexts of traffickings during the rest of the conference. Besides looking at conditions in the places where trafficked persons may originate, it's also important to recognize the role of destinations in helping to create contexts in which trafficking can flourish. When legal labor migration opportunities are constrained, such as at the US-Mexico border or in Fortress Europe, and as asylum seekers and refugees encounter greater and greater difficulties gaining access to desired destinations, the opportunities for trafficking proliferate. As my own research on Thai international labor recruitment revealed, when financial or time costs to migrate legally were too high and returns too low, young Thai village women turned to debt bondage, in which they did not pay their recruitment expenses at the time of migration, but rather had all of their travel expenses, even down to their passport, their visa, their suitcase, their travel clothes, their plane ticket, paid for by a recruiter who then turned them over to an overseas employer to work off these expenses, plus those of the recruiter, for a period of months or until an agreed upon amount of money had been repaid. This type of debt bondage is clearly a form of human trafficking, but for many of the young women in my study villages, it was actually an attractive and quick way to sneak into tightly controlled destinations such as Japan. Moreover, many of the young debt bondage migrants I interviewed said that this mode of recruitment, that trafficking, this form of debt bondage, was actually less risky financially than legal labor migration. This is because legal labor migration required them or their families to put up land or a house of sufficient value to serve as collateral for a loan to local money lenders to pay the travel expenses and recruitment fees at the time of migration. For low-educated, poor young rural women with constrained income-earning opportunities at home, debt bondage was a way to access the high salaries and what they perceived, in many cases, as glamorous lifestyles of the sex or service industry in Macau or Japan, without the need to borrow money from a local money lender and without the risk of losing their family's land or house if problems arose, as they frequently did with other legal international labor migrants from the same village. In my view, no matter how attractive it might be to make generalizations about human trafficking, it's really vital to locate our analysis and problem solving within the specific context of trafficking, both in terms of where trafficked persons originate, the places they pass through, the destinations they wind up in, and the type of work they end up doing. So at this point, I'd like to turn the microphone back over to Kimber, who will field questions from the audience.
I don't see anybody at the microphone. If you've got questions, feel free to line up and I'll take your questions in turn. It looks like we have one person getting ready.
I agree with the first speaker in terms of changing the attitude and the perceptions. A couple of things that I had noticed when I moved to the Bitterroot Valley about 5 years ago after retiring. One of the first things I did was go on to an online site that showed registered sex offenders. I found 3 categories. I found violent sex offenders who were guilty of rape. I found pedophiles, and I found the others. And the others included peeing in public and soliciting a prostitute. I think these sex offender registries need to be more diverse to spell out what these people did, because I certainly don't equate a person who got drunk and urinated in the alley the same as somebody who assaulted a sex worker. And the other thing is the entertainment media. More needs to be done to put pressure on them. I remember a while ago watching a Criminal Minds show that said he was only charged with soliciting a prostitute. And they made it sound like it was nothing. And I think there are a couple actors in Pretty Women who need to apologize for their roles.
Thank you. Melissa, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I'd love to. Did you know they're about to make Pretty Woman into a musical? We're trying to get Julia Roberts and Richard Gere, both of whom have expressed concern about how that's used as a recruiting tool by pimps. I've talked to women who said, I got into it because I saw that movie and I thought it'd be fun and a guy on a white horse would come by and oh. So email me. I'm very accessible by email. I promise I always return emails. I'll put you in touch with those folks. Thank you for bringing up sex offender registries. I didn't mention that the single most effective deterrent in 5 countries is a sex offender registry. It really takes the hip, hobbyist, studly aspect out of buying sex if you're in the same category with rapists and pedophiles. So it's very, very effective. I'm thrilled to hear Montana has this available, and we should, yeah, put little stars by their names or something.
Desiree.
Hi. I have a couple questions, actually. You can answer all of them, none of them. If you could talk for a little bit, Dr. Farley, about your opinions on the Hawaii law about officers and prostitutes being allowed to sleep with them. I think that's what it is. I don't know if you have any opinions on that. Another question is, what would you feel are, what is your opinion on the impacts that certain sex worker rights organizations, I know there's like the Prostitutes Information Center, the Desiree Alliance, you know, some groups like that who are advocating for the rights of sex workers. What impact do you think that they have on trafficking, human trafficking? And then the last question, if you can, the impact of development aid workers, UN, NATO alliances, these kinds of organizations who do, at least I think, in my opinion, contribute to human trafficking on one hand and then are saying to fight it on the other. So either or all of them, thank you.
Well, so I should just sit down here, okay. The Hawaii law, do you guys know about this? I actually talked to this. That Hawaii law was exposed by an anti-trafficking activist, Catherine Zian, in Honolulu, and an AP reporter who was amazing, who I was in touch with. That law's been repealed. However, a similar law currently exists in Michigan. I don't know how these laws made it through, but they permit police officers conducting stings to have sex with women in prostitution in the course of a sting. It's archaic, it's antique, it's part of considering women in prostitution non-human, and let's get rid of those. You know, somebody could do some research seeing if there are any other states where those are in effect. We have a blog on the Prostitution Research and Education website called The Survivor's View. We have two blogs, Traffic Jamming and The Survivor's View. Check out the Survivor's View blog because there are two entries written by an activist, a survivor activist named Stella Marr, called Pimps Will Be Pimps Will Be Pimps. A surprising number of people in these sex worker organizations who are the main mouthpieces are also people who are promoting the sex industry. In San Francisco, two of the main activists, one has an escort agency conviction in Oregon, Maxine Dugan. The other has an interstate trafficking conviction, Robin Few. These are heads of the sex worker organizations there. So there's an interest in promoting the sex industry. It is my view that we really need to seek out survivor activists who've been out of prostitution for a while who want to speak. Because the easiest voices for the media to access are these sex worker groups who are usually promoting the industry. And as I said, I'm not saying 100% of people in prostitution want to get out, just 98%. And the 98% is whose voices I think we should be listening to. What was the other question? Development projects. Do you have an opinion on that? The impact of, was that the question about development projects? You probably know more about that than I do.
No, it's just, so like the UN, for example, at least in my experiences working in Central Africa, you know, they were one of the biggest clientele of the brothels. So,
yes.
I mean, if they're saying that they're going to be working against trafficking, human trafficking, but then they are customers of the industry, I just didn't know if you had any opinions on that matter. I'm sure you have opinions, yes. But if you had any more information about that.
I think I agree with where you seem to be suggesting, which is this is a big problem. And to break it down, wherever there are large groups of men, whether it's a political convention, a sporting event, mining, UN policing in, for example, Congo or South Sudan, or Bosnia, there is prostitution, and the U.S. military has attempted to stop it somewhat unsuccessfully. They've brought forth cases of prosecutions. I would mention that the Swedes take it very, very seriously. Any Swedish state employee or federal employee who travels to another country, buys sex there. There's a case of a Swedish military man in Bosnia who used a woman in a brothel there. And you can imagine the kind of poverty, war zone vulnerability, lack of opportunity for sustainable jobs, all the conditions that Teresa was pointing out promote trafficking. This Swedish military guy bought a woman in a brothel there. What did the Swedes do? They pulled him out of Bosnia, took him back to Sweden, stripped him of all his military pensions, and charged him with a felony. Now that's an appropriate response to the use of a woman for sex by a state employee.
Yes.
Hello to everyone. My name is Shaima. I'm from Afghanistan. My question is mostly from Dr. Melissa. Mostly women are forced to prostitution by men, but they are also encouraged to stay with that business by women. Mostly in some countries, in some cultures such as Afghanistan and India mostly, when women are younger and they are attractive in the sex industry, but later on they get to the point that they have the choice to get out of that business. But they cannot get out of this business for two reasons. Because one, the society does not welcome them so that they can go from this world back to the other world. And some women, they are emotionally, their depression and psychologically, they get to the point that they believe where men buy them, but they get man's manhood by committing the prostitution. So based on your perspective as a researcher, as someone who worked a lot in this area, what are some measures that we can take or these societies can take to help women get out of that prostitution business?
Well, first of all, thank you for pointing out that women family members can actually pimp young women into prostitution and keep them in it. It's true. There are women assistant pimps, women pimps every place. I was at the Fox Club last night, this strip club here. There are two, the young woman told Pamela and me, they're called house moms. That's the same word that's used in brothels, house moms. The young woman stripping and probably prostituting at Fox Club last night told me they had two women, one in what's called the cage, the front entranceway into Fox Club, and one woman in the back. So what can we do to get women out? You know, this is the one place that all of us agree. Everybody agrees. It's a tall order. Stop sex discrimination, stop race discrimination, and work to end poverty. Stop the steady erosion of supports for people that are poor in the United States, and certainly also in Afghanistan. Contribute, help women find jobs that are sustainable, that will keep their families and children fed and clothed and housed and themselves. I mean, these are very, very big social issues. In the long, long run, that's what we need to tackle. In the short run, we need long-term housing for women who are trying to escape prostitution. That's the most urgent need globally that I see. We found a 75% overlap between homelessness and prostitution every place in the world. Right there is a form of coercion. If it's the winter in Montana, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to be exchanging sexual assault for a place to stay for the night.
Could I respond to that as well?
Please.
Certainly in the Thai context, I used to work with a center that was rescuing kids at risk of being sold into prostitution by their families. So it was both mothers and fathers, other family members, wanting the loan or the payment that was given to them so that their child would work in a restaurant or a brothel, whatever, for a period of months or years to repay that debt. And not necessarily because they're the poorest of poor to use it for survival, but increasingly for some of the material accoutrements that they saw other people having that they themselves wanted, whether it was a motorcycle, a new roof on the house, a better house, a refrigerator, these sorts of things. It's also interesting in the Thai context that it's very acceptable for women or girls who have been involved in prostitution to go back home. And maybe it's something particular to the Thai context, the Buddhist context, where your identity is very transitional or transitory. So you could be a prostitute for a while in your life and then go back home, change your name, which is a very popular thing to do, and then marry, have children, and be accepted back into the community. So I think it's something particular to the context, whether it's acceptable back home or not. Even in other villages in Thailand, that's not acceptable, but in the heavy prostitution-sending villages where it's actually now maybe the third generation that's been sent down to work in the brothels, it's become quite acceptable. So can you change norms of people even educating in schools about the acceptability? And also in cases where there's a risk of being re-trafficked, those are the cases I think that Dr. Farley is mentioning, where you need to have some alternative housing, some alternative jobs, maybe not back in the village because there's a risk that the family will still be under pressure to either have the child work off the first loan or to take out a new loan, a new debt for the child to work off.
Thank you, Teresa. And Shaima, thank you for your question. I just wanted to remind you that tonight's session after dinner will consider the rehabilitation and repatriation issues from soup to nuts, so keep that on your agenda. We're going to pause now, but there's a live stream of this event, and see if there might be questions from that audience. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. So aside from that, one last question that we'd like to see might be coming from the Blackboard context. No. So that means we do have time for one last question. If it's a short one, please ask away, and we'll close after your responses, ladies.
My name is Faye Weber. I represent the Women Graduates USA, and I've been on the Trafficking Committee for 5 years. It's an online organization, and we meet once a year, Salt Lake City in September. My question, I had both a global and a Montana one, but you spoke about the problems of trafficking with the Native American population in Minnesota, and there was a doctoral dissertation called Shattered Hearts of a Native American person who addressed the issues of Native Americans being trafficked as Polynesians and exotic people. I grew up in the Bakken area and still have property, and went to school with young people from the Fort Peck Reservation. And there is so much money to be made in that area, and I'm just wondering, what can we do in Montana to provide jobs for women that are high-paying jobs? Even McDonald's is paying $20 an hour, rather than being moved into the area of trafficking.
Are you talking about providing jobs to?
Establishing a network and a training program where women can, and I'm not talking just about McDonald's, but where women can have jobs that are worthy and paid rather than selling their bodies.
Is there
or not selling them, just being put into trafficking?
Thank you for bringing that up. Is there a representative here today from a tribe of people who live in Montana who wants to talk about education, resources? I think you're talking about networking with people whose very lives are the most impacted by this. I'm happy to put you in touch with the co-authors of that report, the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, and they would probably be really happy to work with you on this. And it's about a number of things. It's about domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, drug and alcohol treatment centers, being Native focused. And it's about job creation, housing, poverty reduction. It takes a long-term commitment, and I'm happy to hear you're there with it.
Thank you
It's
for
really
that
important.
question. I'm certain that that topic will be discussed in later sessions today, so stay tuned. Please join me in thanking Drs. Farley and Sobieszczyk